It includes, for example, using timed booking systems to limit the number of people using the facility at any one time, reduced class sizes, equipment will be spaced out, and there will be enhanced cleaning throughout. Now, having allowed hairdressers to reopen, beauticians, tattooists, spas, tanning salons, and other close contact services can now do the same, I'm pleased to say, from Monday.
Hi guys, and welcome back. Thank you all so much for being here, subscribing to my channel and checking out my videos. The UK has finally lifted its lockdown on tattooing, so we can all get back to work. Today we're going to get back straight on it with a big tutorial on how to do colour roses, specifically how I do my colour roses. Obviously there's 101 different ways of doing colour roses, but if you follow me on Instagram and you're interested in the way that I work, hopefully this will give you a good insight into how I do colour roses. I'm going to go through everything from setting up the station, the reasons why I choose certain inks, use certain needles and certain techniques, and then go straight the way through from putting the stencil on to the finished rose. So let's jump straight into it. So first things first, we're going to look at setting up my station. So I tend to set up my station exactly the same every time. You checked out my setting up the station video. That's basically going to show you the up to this point of how I get everything set up. This is going to go one step further. This is going to show you why I choose certain inks and where I place them to make my life easier during the tattoo process. So I'll give you a quick run through of the station. We start from the bottom left, the green stuff that's on the top of the counter. That's a product called Inkies. It's a Vaseline based product, but it's got loads of B vitamins and other nice little products that are going to help keep your client's skin nice and chilled out, help reduce a bit the redness, the irritation for your client. It's going to help them sit that little bit longer. It's going to help kickstart the healing process and give you a better tattoo. Moving up from that, the little disposable cup. So that's the packaging from my grip cover, which is the foam cover that's on my grip on my machine. You turn it upside down and use that as a rinse cup. It saves you having to buy rinse cups, saves the planet, and keeps those polar bears nice and safe. Got my grip cord cover, my razor, all the normal stuff, my rinse bottle. Moving on to my inks. So from the left, moving over to the right. The first bottle, we've got Nocturnal Super Black. Now I've used Nocturnal for a fair few years. Really like the black and grey tones. And the black's really nice. It's very, very strong pigment, but it's also really easy to use. The colour inks that I generally use are Radiant. Moving through these, I've got Bubblegum Pink, I've got Mauve, Nocturnal Super White, Chocolate, which is like a red-based brown, and then we've got grey. So the way I tend to use my colours and the way I choose colours for a colour piece, being a black and grey artist, the way I find it really easy to try and choose the colours is to break it down in the same way that you break down black and grey. So with black and grey, you'll have solid black pigment, dark, medium, light, water, white. The way that I look at using colour is a very similar sort of system. So I've got my pink as my base tone, which will be sort of like like the medium. I've got my mauve, which then becomes a slightly sort of lighter tone. I've got the chocolates become a darker tone, giving my shadows, and the grey sort of is in there, just mixed between those three colours, just to break up the tones and give me a little bit of dynamic sort of shadows and bits and bobs like that. So any sort of colour piece, if I was doing like a red rose, for example, I'd have probably the same dark browny red. I'd have a red tone which would give me my mediums, and then the overall look of the rose, and then a lighter pink to give me those highlights. The way that I sort these out into my ink caps, which you can see at the bottom, top left we've got my black, underneath that is the next darkest tone, which is that chocolate colour. Moving over becomes like the bulk of the colours. So the top one being the slightly darker one is that the bubblegum pink, underneath that the mauve, and then the two sort of highlight sort of extra colours or like mixing tones would be my grey and then my white for my highlights. The four other pots on the end, that's just distilled water. So the way I use distilled water is I'll tap in and out of the water pots after I've gone into my ink. It just loosens the ink up a little bit, makes it a little bit easier for me to work with, makes it easier to clean off the skin, and just allows you to sort of knit those colours together just that little bit easier. Obviously if you're trying to pack something in solid, just go with solid pigment, but once you get into a situation where you're trying to blend together, just that little tap into water is going to loosen it down, give you a nice feathered edge, so that once you've got one colour coming in and a second colour, you just got that nice sort of soft blend. It's going to give everything that nice airbrush finish. Paper towels and the machine. So the machine that I use for this tattoo is the Bishop Phantom. For me, I like the machine for colour packing. It's a very hard hitting machine. It really packs things in, but also gives you that nice smooth finish. Grip covers from True Tubes, just stops that fatigue on your fingers, makes your life a little bit more comfortable, and it's a fixed grip from Bishop as well, their Phantom grip. That's my basic setup. Like I say, I like to keep everything really nice and simple. Don't like to overcomplicate things by having a massive color palette. For me, I just find that makes everything a little bit too confusing. I've always got away with dipping in and out of tones, almost mixing on the fly, mixing in the skin, and my color roses sort of speak for themselves with the finish that you can achieve with a very small sort of color palette. Right, so moving on to needles. The 2 needles that I use for this tattoo, again, I like to keep everything very simple. When I started tattooing, I got the back end of old school tattooing using cold machines, and I've moved that over straight into my tattooing nowadays. Even though I use a cartridge setup and I can use a lot of different needle types and needle setup, for me, I just find it a little bit unnecessary to have 1,000,001 needles set up to do a fairly simple job. So for this tattoo, I'm literally using a liner and a mag shader. So this liner is a type 3 round liner. So basically what you've got there, you've got 3 needles pulled to a point, but the tight or bug pin just means they're going to be pulled that little bit tighter. It's going to give you a little bit more of a crispy line. It's going to pack those needles in nice and tight. It's going to give me all those little details that I need in the middle of the rose, plus it's going to give me the ability to get a nice white highlight around the edges to give me that nice sort of crisp, sharp finish. The shader that I'll be using is a 15 curve bug pin shader. So same sort of situation with the bug pin, in that instead of having the needles spread apart, they're just going to be pulled that little bit close together. It's going to help reduce mag marks. The curved element is a little bit like your fingers. So the way that your fingers sort of curve off at the end, that's the same way that curved mags work. What that's going to do is when you're shading on the skin, if you've got a flat mag, so all the needles are perfectly in line, if you have the mag slightly one way or the other, and obviously skin is bent and you're going to have lots of lumps and bumps, there's every chance you're going to catch an edge. By that, you're just going to be digging those edges in a little bit deeper than the other needles. It's going to pack that color in a little bit stronger. It's going to put a lot of scratchy lines over the surface. It's just going to give you another job that you've got to try and fix. With the curved mags, it's a little bit more forgiving. The surface area is reduced a little bit, so you are going to have to step up the size if you need big coverage. For me, for an average size rose, a 15 mag is perfect to do the big petals and then to bring down into the smaller ones. If the space gets too small, I can just get in there with the liner, and between the two, it'll just get the job done. So the first part of every tattoo is obviously laying the stencil on. If you didn't see one of my previous videos, I know I keep shouting back about my previous videos, but they all kind of work in situ. This is the stencil of the rose, so it's a little bit bigger than what I'd normally do, but we were trying to cover the top section of the shoulder. All the other flowers and roses that are on this sleeve were previously done by myself, so this was one of the last roses that we did on the sleeve, so we just wanted to fill the top section of that. So we've gone a little bit bigger just because I really wanted to fill that space. I'm not going to go into too much detail as to why I do the dotted lines and the solid lines on the stencil. That's all in the how to do a stencil video, but what I'm looking for at this point is just to make sure that my stencil's fairly nice and crisp. So I'm not too worried if I've got some broken lines, as long as I can tell that the broken lines are solid ones and they don't look like the dotted ones. I'm also making sure that I haven't got any smudging. So if you apply slightly too much stencil solution, what you might find is once you place the paper or the carbon sheet onto the skin, if you've got little blobs and you haven't smoothed that stencil stuff out, that's just going to make this carbon bleed underneath the paper and potentially you're going to lose some detail. It's not always the end of the world. Obviously make a judgment call. For me, looking at this, it looked pretty solid. All my lines are there where I need them. I've got some overlap on the existing pieces. Obviously I'm going to be ignoring those sections. If you do find that gets a little bit too confusing, take a little bit of alcohol, put it on a paper towel, and you should fairly accurately be able to take away little bits that you don't need. Otherwise, get a Sharpie or a skin surfer and just make a very obvious point that those lines aren't to be followed. The last thing you want to do is just get carried away, just lining your stencil and then just whip over an existing tattoo. Just make everything as clear as possible at this starting point, and it's just going to make your life easier moving forward. The first part that I do with most tattoos, especially roses, both black and grey and colour, is I'll grey line or scratch line the rose in. What that means in a nutshell is I'm going to whip over with my liner all of my solid lines. So this is where my stencil creation comes into its own. It means I can straight away just see all the solid lines. I know that I've got to hit them one way or the other with a liner needle. What that's going to allow me to do is, one, it's going to make the finished tattoo look that little bit sharper because you put these lines in. Even though these aren't strictly lines, they're temporary lines, but what it's going to do is going to almost carve a trench into the skin. So once you're magging off those lines, it's going to allow that color pigment that you're using for that shadow section just to drop into that little line that you've put in. It's going to have exactly the same tone, but instead of it being fluffy like if you worked off an edge with a mag, it's just going to give you a really nice crisp line, and it's going to make your tattoos look super sharp as opposed to nice and fluffy. Obviously, depending on what sort of finish you're trying to achieve, you might not want to do this technique. For me, it just makes my life that little bit easier and just gives that nice, crisp, in focus pieces. The second big reason why I do this, especially with color, being a black and gray artist, I tend to be quite messy when I do color tattoos, mainly because color ink's a lot thicker, the pigment's a lot heavier. So when you're trying to wipe it off the skin, for me, I tend to make quite a mess. You'll see that I tend to get ink everywhere. What I find, if I try and keep that as clean as when I'm doing black and gray, I'll be wiping twice as much and I'll end up wiping most of my stencil off. If I scratch line, gray line, all my lines in the tattoo, you physically can't wipe that off because you've tattooed a line in. So it just gives you that little bit of a safety net just in case you wipe too much of your stencil off. Obviously all the dotted lines still have the ability to wipe off, so I've still got to try and maintain my stencil throughout the tattoo. But like I say, I want it mainly to keep the sharpness in the rows, but secondly, it's also going to give me that little bit of breathing space, a little bit of safety that I'm not going to wipe off the tattoo and get completely lost. If I do end up wiping off the dotted lines, all it means is that I've just got to eyeball my stencil a lot more just to make sure that I'm getting the tones and the shadows in the right places and I'm not missing any little bits. So moving on to the shading, this is straight after me scratch lining all the edges. I tend to start from the bottom of the tattoo and work up. This is common practice, again, to maintain your stencil. Obviously, if you start at the top and you start wiping down over the piece, what's going to happen is you're just going to start rubbing your stencil off and you're going to be in a world of problems. If you do, for whatever reason, need to start at the top, just make sure that you're wiping away from your stencil at all times. For me, the easiest thing is just start from the bottom and work my way up. With roses, it tends to make sense to do that anyway. For me, I find an important part of any tattoo process is to get a dark element in first. So what that allows you to see is a black point in the tattoo. So if I was doing black and gray, for example, I'd find a section of my tattoo that was solid black pigment, dark, medium, and light. You want to make sure that none of those tones are as dark as that black point. That way, the final look of the tattoo is going to be as close to the reference as you can possibly get, and you're not going to lose any values in the piece. So for roses, generally they all work out pretty well with this sort of theory in mind, in the sense of if you've got a rose flower and you take a photo of it, most of the time it's going to be lit by sunlight, so all the shadows are going to sit towards the bottom of the rose. So because I want to work from the bottom, all the shadow sections is going to be there, which means I can get a black point in straight away and it shouldn't confuse any of the values moving forward. So looking at this image here, you can see that underneath this petal in the middle, so where I've got this darkest section, that sits underneath that petal, which is giving us a fairly dark shadow. So that's one of my darkest points. It's not quite solid black, but what we're looking at is a black point. So with color work, it just means the darkest tone. The best way to check this is once you finish the tattoo, turn it black and gray, and that should look like a nice black and grey piece with dark, medium, light tones within that piece. If it starts to look very flat and loses a lot of its contrast, you haven't gone dark enough with those dark values and you haven't gone light enough with the highest values, so the contrast isn't quite there. So turn your colour pieces black and grey. It'll give you an idea of what you need to do for your next tattoo to make it a little bit more high contrast, and that's going to give you a better looking colour piece moving forward. So starting with this shadow, this is just that rollover edge, the shadow underneath the petal and one of the bottom ones. What I tend to do is get my dark tones in first, then move on to medium and then light. Sometimes I get some white highlights in throughout the process. Textbook tattooing will say don't put white in until the end. For me, with colour pieces, I've never really found a problem with colours getting muddied. Obviously, it all depends on how much trauma you cause to the skin. For me, I try to keep the trauma down to a minimum. In my mind, the less amount of trauma that I can cause to the skin during the tattoo process, the better the heal's going to be. Obviously, if you're causing a lot of trauma throughout the healing process, that tattoo is just going to scale up a lot more. Your client's going to have a harder time looking after it, and you're going to risk more and more of the tattoo dropping out, and it just means more touch-ups for you moving forward. So try and keep the trauma down to a minimum. It's going to make your life that little bit easier. And like I say, for me, getting whites in early, even with wiping over the top with colours, I don't tend to muddy up. And it just makes my life that little bit easier because I can get I can get a second coat of white over the top at the end, and it just makes everything really punchy. It just gives you that real nice high contrast. So you can see that these two bottom petals are pretty much there. I've got my dark tones in, some of the mid tones, and a little bit of the highlights. It still needs a little bit of blending together. So the idea of letting them settle, at the moment they're a little bit too pink, and a lot of that isn't physically the tattoo ink. So a lot of that is just skin irritation, a little bit of the blood coming through, and that's just going to change your tones and make them a little bit more red. So if you're using yellows, for example, they're going to look a bit more orangey. If you're using pinks, they're going to look a little bit more red, and the same with whites, they're going to start looking a little bit pink. The last thing you want to do is keep hitting the same section, trying to get that colour in nice and solid, and all you're doing is just fighting against that irritation, and what you're going to end up doing is just overworking the skin and causing too much trauma. The best thing to do is imagine that you're tattooing black. Think in your head how long it should take you to pack that black in on an average day. If you feel like you're spending too much time trying to pack it in, it's probably not because of the skin or your needles or the ink. It'll just be that irritation. So just hit it once, move on to the next section, let it settle down. You'll probably find that everything's been packed in perfectly. If not, you can then go over and give it a second coat, and that way you're not going to cause too much extra trauma. You're going to just be hitting the skin exactly the amount that it needs to get that colour packed in nice and solid. Like I say, without churning up the skin, one, causing your client a lot of pain, and two, you're just going to be damaging the skin too much. So you can see now that I'm working my way across these bottom petals. The way I tend to attack a rose is I'll do the big outside petals first, and then work my way into the middle, and then I'll do my highlights and then work my way back out. That way I can get all my dark tones in, get the larger, bigger petals out the way first. I tend to find because they are bigger, they take a little bit longer just to try and get them smooth. The smaller, more complex sections should be a little bit more tricky, but because you've got little tiny sections that you're filling in, I tend to fire through them a lot faster. So get the big ones out the way first, then you can get the small ones in, keep all your values nice and solid. This petal on the right hand side, I've left a lot of skin gap. A lot of that's going to be white. With colour tattoos, they take a little bit longer, mainly because you're hitting 100% of the skin, as opposed to black and grey where you might be hitting 50-60%, leaving a lot of skin gaps just as skin to give you those highlights. Colour pieces, all of those sections should be packed in with some colour, whether it's white, a skin tone, but you are looking for 100% saturation. That's how you can get that nice, almost sticker look to the finish. For me, that's always been a really good guide to indicate that I've nailed a tattoo colour-wise, is that it should look like you put a sticker transfer, you know, one of the little cheap tattoos you can buy what you put on with water. It should look like that on the skin, super solid, super saturated. So I've added a little bit of white onto that petal. You can see how much that's helped to smooth it out. So going back to what I've just said about keeping it super saturated, this is exactly what I mean. It allows you to blend those color tones together. Even though that still stayed as a really light section, I haven't changed the shape or the size of that area, but by putting those whites in, it's allowing me just to knit those colors together. Again, just feathering the two edges together, and it's just giving you that nice sort of soft airbrush finish. So now I'm moving sort of clockwise round. So I'm over at sort of 9 o'clock, getting those dark shadows in on that side. So there's a lot of sharp angular pieces on this side, which all require a lot of heavy shadows. So with the heavy shadows, it's just gonna make those petals that are sitting on top lift up that little bit and just emphasize that 3D. So once this is turned black and gray for my personal reference at the end, in Photoshop, it'll just allow me to make sure that I'm getting those nice values in there and the contrast is high enough so it's going to stand the test of time, and you're just going to be able to see what's going on, and you're not just going to get a really flat cabbage looking rose at the end of it. So I've left a lot of skin gaps here, mainly because I've been adding a lot more colour towards the top. I don't want to be putting too much white into these sections whilst everything's fairly fresh. I'm moving quite quickly because that white is still going to be very porous because I'll have just broken the skin. By wiping, there is a chance that it is going to muddy. So time management is a little bit crucial. With colour pieces, I will be packing some white into those sections in a bit, but again, just bearing in mind that I want to try and keep that trauma down so that as I am wiping other colours over the top, I can just make sure that those whites aren't going to get muddied up and they're going to stay nice and crisp. So you can see that I've added a little bit of white into those empty sections, and a little bit on the left hand side at sort of 11 o'clock. Started moving around towards the top, again getting those heavier shadows in. You can see that they're not quite as heavy as those ones at the bottom, because at the top we haven't got anything cast on them, it's just itself casting the shadow. So we're sort of in the realm of dark more than black, but again, none of these shadows are specifically black. It'll just be the chocolate loaded up on my tip and then just tapped into the black, just to give it that little bit of an extra step into dark. What I don't want to be doing is using solid black on its own, because it's just going to be too harsh. You want to just use that black to darken down your tones so that it's still staying a colour more than just black. So here you can see that I've started packing in the bulk of the colour, so just using that nice sort of candy paint just to whip over, start getting the shapes in, all the little dips and bends that are in that petal. I've got a little bit of white in there, a little bit of grey on the right hand side, just to give me a shadow that isn't quite a heavy shadow, but just slightly darker than the main colour of the rose. That just is going to give you that nice sort of rollover on the edges of the petals. I have put a bit more white in there now, just giving everything like a little bit of a second coat, just to make sure that the white's packed in nice and solid. Again, going back to what I was saying before, just giving it time to settle down to make sure that it does need any extra white, and I can just keep topping up as I go along. That way, once I get to the end, it's not a case of I've just left all the gaps for white, start putting that in, it's going to get irritated and red. So once you get to what you think is the end of the tattoo, it's all looking pink and it looks like you haven't put any white in at all. So here on this one, this is a good sort of sign to show sort of how much in the way of sort of bleeding I tend to cause during the tattoo process. No tattoo should be dripping with blood, so you shouldn't be causing that much trauma, but at the same time, every tattoo, if not all tattoos, are going to have a certain amount of bleeding, just basically down to the fact that you're sticking needles in someone's skin. It should be fairly light, like you're not looking at sort of, it shouldn't be dripping off people's fingers, even though that sounds pretty grim, but there are people that do really dig for gold when they first start tattooing. On this photo, you can see the difference between sort of the 11 o'clock petal and these petals down here at like sort of 4 o'clock, how much that looks a lot more settled. So the skin irritation around the outside is at an absolute minimum. The whites and the pinks are starting to knit together really nice. You can see that nice soft blending of the tones. At the top, it's still looking a little bit choppy. Once that settles down a little more, it will soften. But what I would look at doing is just letting that settle a little bit longer. Just give myself a bit of time whilst I do some more of the petals. See how much that isn't blending, then I can go back over with some whites or some pinks just to knit that together. So again, with that sort of that bleeding wiped off, you can see how white those whites are underneath. So compared to the previous photo where we've got a lot of pinks because of the blood coming through, you can see underneath that how white those whites are once it settles. So again, going back to causing too much trauma to the skin, if I had just kept hitting that skin trying to make those pink sections white, one, it would never have happened because I'd just be causing more trauma and making it more pink and red. And then again, yeah, just over traumatizing the skin, it's going to give me a really bad heal. By just giving it a few minutes, a few little wipes just to make sure that's nice and settled, you can see exactly what you're left with. And by looking at that, I probably won't even need to put any extra white in later on. It looks pretty solid. So I'm starting to move in to the middle sections now. So I've just hit some of the really dark shadows in the middle, and I'll start moving my way back out once I've got those in. The reason why I've jumped in the middle is as I've been working around, my stencil is slowly coming off. So I just wanted to make sure that I've got those few little bits in the middle before I completely rub off all my little shadow and reference lines from my stencil. So at this point, I pretty much hit all of the base tones. So by base tones, I mean just all those pinks. So all like the bulk of the color. I've got to go back in and pack out the white, which is going to give us that nice smooth look, like we were saying on the other petals. So as I was losing those reference lines, so the dotted lines, I've just gone through and just hit all of the sections that have got the medium or shadow sections, just so I've got all of that reference in before I destroy the stencil. But at this point, because I've done that, all the empty gaps now are just ready to have that white put in, which is going to give us that nice smooth finish and that lovely solid look. So this is just before I start hitting my edges back with my liner. So at this point, all I've used is my mag shader. That's blocked everything in. Everything's looking pretty solid, but for me it's just not quite crispy enough. The edges could do with it being a little bit sharper, a little bit more clear. So what I do at this point is I'll get rid of my 15 mag, I'll go back to my 3-round liner, and I'll start off by doing shadows. So what people would normally do is just go straight into the white and start hitting all the edges of their petals, and just putting in those highlights. What I tend to do is do low lights first. So I'll be going in with that chocolate, and all of the shadows I'll basically be doing what you would do with highlights, but with low lights. So anywhere where we've got a dark shadow, any sort of like underside of a petal where it's going to be casting a heavy shadow, I'll just go through and just drop in some low lights. That gives me a real nice solid shadow, so nothing looks fluffy, so I'm not left with just really crisp highlights and then a really loose shadow. I want those shadows to be as crisp as my highlights. This is the finished rose, so you can see where I put in those highlights. You can see on the edges where I've got those real nice sharp crispy highlights. The little water droplets, there's 2 on the right hand side on the bottom, and then there's 1 just tucked underneath. You can see how those little white highlights really emphasize those water droplets, and you can just see how much that looks like a sticker placed on. So going back to my little rule of thumb with color pieces, especially roses, that's what I'm aiming for. I'm aiming for that look that it's just been placed on top of the skin. You can see that the trauma is not too bad. Some of the sections that I hit towards the end, at the top, that little pink glow around the outside, that's all normal. That's just a standard irritation that you'll get with any tattoo. That will settle down by the time my client gets home. Chances are that will have settled right back. At this point, you can see how white the whites look. So that's a combination of the fact that I hit them earlier on in the day, and then I've been able to just re-hit them nice and gently at the end just to top up those whites. So nothing's looking pink, and it's looking exactly how I want value-wise. When I first started tattooing, I used to look at tattoos and wonder how they get the whites so white. For me, this is how I do it. I'm hitting them maybe 2-3 times throughout the day, making sure that I'm not muddying them, but that last final hit over the top, nice and light, just really packs it in there and keeps it nice and solid. Throughout the tattoo process, I also use Bactine, which is an antiseptic spray with a little bit of lidocaine in it, which is going to help settle the skin down. It's going to make your clients feel a little bit better as well. It's not going to numb the tattoo, but it will take the edge off. What it also helps to do, it helps to settle the tattoo down, so it will reduce a lot of the red, a lot of the irritation. So yeah, Bactine or any other sort of lidocaine based antiseptic spray is going to really make your life that little bit easier. There are processed butters like Inkies, Hustle Butter, and there's tons of other products out there that will allow you to put this into the process as you're tattooing, but for me, I've used Bactine since pretty much day one, and yeah, it really helps my job. So there you go guys, that is exactly how I do a rose from start to finish, from stencil to finished rose, plus how I set up my station and the reasons why I choose certain needles and certain ink. Hopefully that's given you guys a little bit of an insight into how I do colour roses. It's exactly how I do black and grey roses, just in monotone. I do pack in a lot of white, the same as what you've seen in the colour piece from black and grey ones. I will run through how I do black and grey roses on a later video. This is primarily just for colour work. I'll do some colour portrait stuff later on. I mainly do a lot of roses, so yeah, you're going to get a lot of tips on roses. They are a staple in the tattoo world, so yeah, hopefully that's given you a good insight into, like I say, how I do roses. I know there's 101 different ways of doing it. It's the way I do it every single time. It makes my life super easy, and I get nice results from it. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to drop me a like. If you're not subscribed already, make sure to subscribe to my channel for all my new tattoo tips and tutorials. I'm going to try and get some big time-lapse videos on as well later on, especially now that we can get back into the studio tattooing, so you can see exactly how I produce these tattoos from start to finish in real time. Thank you all so much for watching. I'll see you on the next video. Peace!